In the last video on the Green Man, part 2 that is, we discussed how these horned nature deities had their roots, found their origins in the proto-mythological belief system. That they were not just figures that roamed about whimsically in the imagination of mankind, but there seemed to be, arguably, a prototype deity. What I believe, and I would argue for, was perhaps the first god known to mankind. In other words, the first deity that the human imagination was able to conjure for itself. But this Green Man motif was not simply isolated to the proto-mythological belief system. And it certainly wasn't isolated to the thousands in the BC, in other words, but it survived into an observable reality within the modern world. The Green Man motif, or these horned nature deities, very akin to Cernunnos and so forth, they found their outlet into a more humanized world, into a world where we placed more emphasis on the people-like persona of deities. And for instance, they survived into characters in the pagan world such as Odin, specifically in the Nordic pagan belief system, or in the Celtic pagan belief system, we see it survive in the image of Lugh, or Lugh in other words. So if we look at Odin, we see exactly how this motif seemed to be preserved into this modern world. Odin, for instance, was a horned figure more often than not. Very early depictions of Odin show him with antlers or with horns. This connects him, of course, with the nature deities who were antlered deities. Furthermore, Odin was also affiliated with magic. He was seemingly the embodiment of magic, and he was the god of magic, so to speak. And because he was the god of magic, he was also extremely affiliated with shamanism. So these early horned deities were also affiliated with magic, considered magic embodied, so to speak, and they were also extremely affiliated with shamanism, as we discussed in the last video. But even more so than this, Odin was a psychopomp. He was a figure or a deity who could go between the worlds. He could go between the world of the living and between the world of the dead. But not only that, but he could also go into the world of the gods, which is where he permanently resided. And more so than anything, Odin represented aspects of death and resurrection. He himself died on the world tree of the Yggdrasil and was resurrected, so to speak, in order to gain the wisdom of the runes. But also, Odin had very nature-like affiliations. He was very much affiliated with animals of various sorts. He had his two crows, or two ravens in other words, Hugin and Munin. He had his wolves, and he himself could transform or shapeshift into various animals. That is also shown more often than not as a sort of woodland wanderer, that he was a vagrant or vagabond of the wilderness. Yet the Green Man motif did not simply just survive in the form of deities, but it also became countless spirits and entities and symbolic forces of nature. For instance, they became countless land spirits, nature spirits, nymphs and sprites associated with rivers and mountains, and that continued into the Nordic era, or into the Viking era, if you will. The Norse pagans had a deep and significant relationship with land spirits, perhaps even more so than their actual deities that we know, like Thor and Freya and Odin even. But also, they survived in the form of fairies and goblins and elves and sprites and changelings and brownies and so forth, wild men, in other words. So they survived in this vast landscape of the human imagination where we see all these countless archetypes flourishing. And in some respects, they took on a more leafy and foliage like character, which we see represented in the Green Man archetype. But in other ways, they shed their naturey kind of aspect and they became more humanistic, so to speak. But the Green Man also survived in various folk tales and folk traditions, and this might actually give us a little bit of insight into how he was viewed in the ancient world. For instance, we see the Green Man represented in Sir Gawain or Garwin and the Green Knight. Here, the Green Knight is a mysterious character which seemingly the reader is already supposed to know about. So, in other words, we don't think that it was a construct of the author's imagination, but we think that this was a long-standing motif or idea, and the author simply utilized this. But Sir Gawain and the Green Knight comes to us from the 1300s. It's a chivalric poem deeply tied in with the Arthurian legend, and it comes to us from an unknown author. What happens in Gawain and the Green Knight is on Christmas Eve, the Green Knight busts into the celebration in Arthur's Hall, King Arthur's Hall, and he presents a challenge. The challenge of his course, he is to be beheaded. And this, of course, represents the death and resurrection motif that we see in the earliest deities, these horned nature deities, and it also represents what the Green Man seemingly represents to modern paganism or in our modern mythos. So even in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, he's representing a cyclic aspect. This also seems to reflect what Fraser in The Golden Bough is talking about with these various foliage-like characters, where they're symbolically killed and then resurrected in various celebrations and festivals, mostly having to do with the winter solstice or Christmas time, and of course spring. And we see this represented in Jack the Green, in Maytag or Maytog and May Day celebrations. And usually it is a man or a girl or a woman dressed in green or foliage representing a nature aspect. They are ceremoniously beheaded or drowned, and then they are resurrected. And this, of course, represents the aspect of nature dying away in winter and resurrecting again in spring. And this was done symbolically. It was all an act. It was all a play. It was a portrayal. It actually didn't mean anything, and nobody was actually killed or harmed in these rites and ceremonies. Yet the Green Man didn't only just survive in classical literature, but he also survived in various folk characters, like, for instance, Peter Pan. He was deeply influenced by the Green Man motif. The Jolly Green Giant, Robin Hood, all of these characters are green foliage based characters that have deep affiliations with the woodland areas. We also see the Ents in J.R.R. Tolkien's fantastical world, or the Dryads in C.S. Lewis's fantastical worlds, which of course C.S. Lewis borrowed from the Dryads of the Greek mythology, which were direct deviations of the Green Man motif, and Tolkien, of course, borrowed his ideas from the Green Man archetype in and of itself. But we see how countless different ways this Green Man image survived into the modern world. However, there is still a debate as to the overall authenticity of what we consider the Green Man. Today, among a lot of scholars, it is thrown into question as if the Green Man ever actually existed in the form that we hold him in today. There's a lot of speculation that it is a figment of the modern imagination and is directly attributed to the rise in neo-paganism. For instance, the name Green Man was coined in a 1936 article by Julia Somerset Hamilton. It was the only article that she had ever written, and it happened to be about folklore. And she had written this in the Journal of Folklore, formerly known as the Folklore Journal. From her article, there was an extreme resurgence of interest in not only folklore, but in folkloric entities, very specifically nature entities and foliage-based entities. The Green Man rapidly became a net term to catch all of these images of foliage-faced entities, so to speak. And then all the speculations began to circulate about the actual origins of the Green Man. But it became very clear that there was a new wave of interest in these foliage vegetation deities, so to speak. 30 years later, the Green Man was adopted by the hippie movement, and it was a back to earth type concept. It was a representation of returning to nature, so to speak. After that, we see that it was taken up by the New Age movement, and of course, the New Age movement gave way to the modern pagan movement, neo-paganism. And neo-paganism has taken it and made it a flourishing icon of the modern world, so to speak. Yet, one bad thing that occurred with Hamilton's article was the fact that she was treading new waters. She was in uncharted territories, and therefore she did make some mistakes. I believe these mistakes were rather minor in context to the greatness that she was actually performing, but a lot of people take these mistakes as fundamental flaws in her overall theory. And so there's this new trend among a lot of people to where if somebody makes a singular little mistake, then we toss out the whole of their work. We toss out the whole of their ideology and we consider them fools or buffoons, so to speak. So the whole of Hamilton's ideology has been tossed out because of a few minor mistakes. But on top of this, the Green Man motif or the Green Man image, the whole idea of the Green Man has been tossed out as well. To me, this is tossing out the baby with the wash, so to speak. I think it's ridiculous, and I think that it's a redundant aspect that we need to be able to move past and accept mistakes without throwing out everything to do with the thinker who made the mistake, so to speak. Very specifically, Hamilton was attacked in a 2016 article that was published in the New Yorker where it called all of her work total and absolute bunk. And therefore it threw out the whole idea and concept of the Green Man motif. But even before that, she was more intellectually attacked when it was theorized that the whole Green Man image, which she was coined as conjuring up herself, was a need represented by society. It was a counterculture motif. It was an icon or a hero type image of a world that was beginning to realize the devastating effects of industrialization. So even before 2016, it was theorized that the whole Green Man motif was just a modern concept. But I have to beg to differ on this. I don't believe that it is a concept of the modern world. I think that it does indeed have very ancient roots. First of all, I would have to argue where and why did we see all these motifs come up in the Middle Ages? Why was it in art and architecture everywhere? Why did we see it in literature? And why do we see such common threads through historic deities? To me, this is all evidence and attestation to the fact that there was indeed a Green Man motif that existed in the ancient pagan world. Furthermore, I would say that even if it was an aspect of the modern mind, it is one that is deeply rooted in historic validation. It is one that has historic authenticity to it, and therefore cannot be considered simply and purely a concept of the modern imagination, so to speak. But there can be no doubt that the Green Man image and motif has a significant meaning to the modern world, the same as it did to the ancient world. And I believe it is a call back to nature. And I think that is why we're seeing such a strong resurgence of the Green Man motif, because we are now experiencing a new form of counterculture. We are now experiencing a movement which is anti-capitalist, which is anti-corporate thinking, and which is anti-industrialization. We're wanting to protect and admire and love our world and our nature instead of utilizing it, abusing it, and absolutely raping it, for lack of better terms. And the Green Man motif represents a deified respect for nature. It represents a mystique in nature, and it represents the elemental natural forces. So I believe that the Green Man motif, even if it is a new construct, has very deep instinctual and primordial aspects which cannot be ignored.